Welcome. I'm Stephen J. Garvey, founder, leader of National Citizens Alliance of Canada, NCA. We have a pretty amazing presentation tonight on climate change, global warming, carbon tax, and tonight is part one of two, and we're gonna focus on the history behind the UN agenda of climate change and carbon tax. We're going to be looking at the Canadian Maurice Strong. We're going to look at the history. And we're going to connect the dots. We're going to connect the dots on all this UN Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, and sorry about that. There was an incoming call. But we're going to connect all the dots tonight, so please listen in closely. This is pretty mind-blowing stuff tonight, and I'm going to get right into it. There's a quote I want to share. And this basically summarizes what's been going on with the UN Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. And it says here, quote, "The strategy which was planned by the Club of Rome along with top globalists like former UN Director Robert Mueller, was to create the idea of an environmental threat so potentially devastating that the only option would be for the public to accept global governance as a solution. Global warming and climate change became the existential threat. It does not seem to matter how often or how brutal the climate change argument is debunked by real data. The globalists desperately push the ideology. Climate change is a primary key to everything they hope to accomplish in terms of centralization, and their timeline is set for the year Agenda 2030. Agenda 2030, the year 2030 is very significant. Year 2030 refers to UN Agenda 2030, which Harper adopted in September of 2015. Agenda 2030 is the extension of Agenda 21, and this is all about global governance. Globalists also seem to enjoy fabricating fake moral dilemmas which force people to choose between one evil solution or another. The fake moral dilemma here being that if we do not accept global centralization and elitist management of the planet, we are risking the destruction of our environment on a apocalyptic scale. So to summarize this quote, this climate change, global warming, we're not denying that there's a warming going on, but it's completely exaggerated. It's created into a false existential threat that pushes global governance. And we're going to make the case tonight on this. And in the second part, we're going to talk about the false science behind carbon CO2 and the carbon tax. So we're going to get into that in part two. But today is a history. And a lot of Canadians don't know this, but a Canadian was behind this whole agenda. And he was backed by wealthy globalists, the Rothschild, the Rockefeller, etc. And this person's name is Maurice Strong. And I'm going to talk about the history of Maurice Strong. I'm going to put up a picture of him. This guy, he originally was out of Manitoba. Hold on a sec here. Give me a second here. I want to get that photo up there. Maurice doesn't want his photo shown. There he is. This guy is a complete outright globalist. He's been pushing it since since all his life practically. It really amped up from 1947 on. But we're going to get into the background on Maurice Strong. So we're going to go into history. He started working for the United Nations back in 1947, where he became a cohort of the Rockefeller globalists and the Rothschilds. And it should be noted, Maurice Strong is a member of the Privy Council of Canada. He still is a member, even though he's deceased. He died a few years ago, but he's a member of the shadow government in Canada. He's a self-professed socialist in ideology, but a capitalist in methodology. He organized the first Earth Summit, the Stockholm Conference, in 1972, after being appointed head of the United Nations Environmental Panel, UNEP. The lead to the formation of more UN organizations, the Earth Council, the Earth Charter, the World Resources Institute, the World Wildlife Fund, later run by Gerald Butts, Commission for World Governments. Maurice wanted to tax the world in order to pay for global governance in the UN. He was proposing a 0.5% tax on all transactions. This was vetoed by the Security Council. And then he came up with a new idea for UN global governance, which led to UN Agenda 21. In 1989, Maurice was appointed to Secretary General of the Earth Summit. In 1992 at the Earth Summit, he was quoted as telling UN delegates, quote, "It is clear that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving high meat intake, consumptions of large amounts of frozen and convenience foods, use of fossil fuels, appliances, home and workplace, air conditioning, suburban housing are not sustainable." So that's where all this sustainable development came from. The Rio Summit in 1992 led to UN Agenda 21. You can't make this stuff up. These are the facts, everyone. And it was the globalist conservatives under Brian Mulroney who adopted UN Agenda 21 in 1992. And I've got the document here for you to see. This is UN Agenda 21. Go look it up. Agenda 21 PDF. So this is all about global governance, open borders, global citizenry, erosion of Canadian sovereignty, elimination of Canadian citizenry. That's what it's all about. There is the document there. We have videos on it. Go check them out. But this is I know there's people out there who are afraid of the truth and they yell conspiracy. But this isn't made up. These are facts. They're just afraid. They want to hang on to the status quo, so they cry conspiracy. What's interesting to note too is that the Earth Summit also gave rise to the World Conservation Bank, which was controlled by the Rothschilds and Rockefellers. This bank controls the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Agenda 21 was hailed as a comprehensive blueprint for reorganizing human society using environmental protection to induce Western societies to voluntarily surrender their rights and freedoms on a mostly emotional appeal to saving the environment. So this is just a globalist scheme for global governance. And it should be noted here, In 2000, the UN held the Millennium Summit, launching the Millennium Project featuring 8 sustainable goals to be reached by 2015. Then when these goals were not met, that's when they created UN Agenda 2030 in September 2030. In September 2015, which, as mentioned, Harper adopted for Canada. And it should be noted as a footnote, Jordan Peterson worked on Agenda 2030 as well. That is a fact. He worked on a UN a high-level committee on creating that document. The UN Agenda 2030 has all the goals matching Agenda 21, and they're being implemented across Canada right now. For all the naysayers out there, just go look up Agenda 2030 right here. Agenda 2030 PDF, there it is. It has 17 so-called sustainable development goals. Again, this is all about global communism, open borders, global citizenry, and ultimately global governance. And here, this is the Government Canada website. In September 2015, Canada adopted Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. And if we scroll down, in the budget 2018, the government announced it would provide around $50 million over 13 years to establish sustainable development goals. And they're using Statistics Canada, but we're going to get into that next time. I'm just going to play a short clip on Maurice Strong here. I have a video at the end that's really revealing, but I'll play this short little clip on him.
Maurice Strong doesn't have any ambition for the United Nations to become the world government.
No, and it's not necessary, it's not feasible, and certainly we're a long way from any such thing. But we do need, if we're going to have a more peaceful world, a more secure world, we need a more effective system of cooperation, which is what I call system of governance. And the United Nations, with all its difficulties, is the best game in town.
For those of you fortunate enough not to be acquainted with that face, that is Maurice Strong, Canadian globalist extraordinaire, and the man behind more United Nations-based and general international environmental sustainable development organizations than you can shake a stick at, and a card-carrying member of the oligarchy handpicked by David Rockefeller at the ripe young age of 17 years old to become a Alberta Rockefeller representative, and made his millions in the Alberta oil patch by the time he was in his mid-20s, with plenty of Rockefeller help. And the story just gets crazier and crazier from there, propelling this unlikely high school dropout from Oak Lake, Manitoba into the heights of political royalty and royal royalty and financial royalty, all the way to the summit, the peak, the pinnacle itself, Edmund de Rothschild, with whom he co-founded the Global Environmental Facility.
Okay, I'm going to shift now. We're going to look at how this whole idea of global warming, climate change came into being. And this is where the real deception lies. And we can thank another Canadian who helped expose this, Tim Ball, a climatologist. So we're going to get into that a little bit tonight. But next part is going to go deeper into that. The real deception behind this. But the whole idea of climate change, global warming, the idea started in 1896, and it was rejected by mainstream science all the way up to the 1950s, with Britain's world-leading expert C.E.P. Brooks and the American Meteorology Society declared that CO2 can have no measurable impact on the Earth's climate. So what happened? This is where the deception comes in. In 1988, Maurice Strong hired a computer modeler, Michael Mann, from Penn State University, to create a graph purporting to be a representation of climate statistics for the past 1,000 years. And this is where the deceptions and the fraud comes in. Mann's new 1,000-year temperature proxy was the most iconic image in the UN highly influential third assessment report on climate change. It showed a distinct hockey stick. And I've got an image right here. This is the hockey stick image. It's pretty much flat across and then it shoots up. That image was shown to be falsely put together. Data was suppressed. Other data was pushed to the side to create this urgency to deal with climate change. And this graph here shows the deception. These warm periods were all deleted. Even and just flatlined right across. So the blue is the correct temperature, and this is Mann's, the yellow. All the yellow is Mann's, straight across, and then the hockey stick. But he just completely manipulated the data to show that there's a crisis right now. It was flat across, and then boom. But the reality, it shows these warmer periods in the 1500s, which were omitted by Mann, and he went straight across, pretty much straight across there to the hockey stick. This was the deception to create the crisis, the sense of urgency for this agenda to be pushed. Remember the quote at the beginning. They want to create the destruction of our environment as a apocalyptic threat. So they fudged the data and they showed that. We're not denying that the Earth is warmer now, but they exaggerated what led up to it and other warm periods, and they exaggerated the extent of the warmth right now through manipulating computer modeling. And thank you to Tim Ball. He was the one who called out Maurice Strong. And this went to court, and Mann was held in contempt of court in Canada. He refused to provide the evidence because he didn't want to get exposed. In Tim Ball's own words, Agenda 21 was the overall environmental plan of the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, which was led by Maurice Strong, and it makes claims not supported by the evidence as an excuse to impose a world government, end quote. So this is very disturbing. Those are the facts. We're going to get into the science next time. I just want to show you an article on Maurice Strong. I'm just going to highlight some key points here. It's interesting. The co-founder of the World Economic Forum, which is all behind global governance, Davos, the World Economic Forum, he said, quote, Maurice was a great visionary and always ahead of our times in his thinking. And Davos is all about global governance, sustainable development, etc., etc. And then even Justin Trudeau says Maurice Strong was a pioneer of sustainable development who left our country and our world a better place. That's highly, highly questionable. But this is all on his background, his connection to globalists, the Rockefellers. He was head of the Power Corporation of Canada, which has strings on all the parties in Ottawa. And what's interesting down here, he was finally caught for his fraud. In 2005, he was caught taking a donation from a South Korean businessman while he was working for the UN of $1 million. He fled to China, where he ended up dying. That is a fact. There's the check there that he received. So this is basically a kickback he received. He was finally caught. Pretty disgusting. And let me just take one more look at that article. It should be pointed at the top too here about, he has ties to Paul Martin, James Wolfensohn, Kofi Annan, Conrad Black, Al Gore, etc., etc. The check too, it was tied to the Food for Oil program in Iraq, which was for starving children. And he was taking a kickback there at the expense of these starving children. So I think that pretty much sums what he's about. I'm gonna play a short video here so you can hear it from his mouth. This is in 1972 at the first Earth Summit, in Maurice Strong's own words.
With all the evidence that we've amassed in our preparations for the Stockholm Conference, including the views of many of the world's leading scientists, I am convinced that the prophets of doom have got to be taken seriously. In other words, doomsday is a possibility. I'm equally convinced that doomsday is not inevitable.
Why do you think they have to be taken seriously?
Well, they have to be taken seriously because it has become apparent that today man's own activities have reached the scale where they are the principal determinants of his own future. For example, we are now, today, effecting more changes in the composition of the atmosphere, in the composition of the waters of the world, in even the composition of certain elements in our food chain. We're making more of these changes in one generation that have been made in millions of years of human evolution. We don't know exactly what will be the ultimate impact of these changes, but we do know that many of them are irreversible, and many of them could be decisive in their effects on man's future. This question is not a matter of one man or one group of people's predictions. It's a matter of the fact that an increasing number of very serious-minded scientists have produced evidence from a whole series of events, many of them the well-known pollution or environmental problems that have come to our attention, that the natural world in which man lives and on which he depends is indeed deteriorating, is being destroyed in many instances at a rate that is accelerating, and that can only continue to accelerate unless we begin to control the activities that are having this destructive impact. Now, whether we are pessimistic or optimistic depends really on what we think about the nature of man. Whether we really believe that man, in light of this evidence, is going to be wise enough and enlightened enough to subject himself to this kind of discipline and control.
The film Zero Population Growth predicts a society in the next century where there is overpopulation, where there is extreme pollution, and where people can no longer be allowed to have babies. Now, is this the shape of things to come?
Well, I haven't seen the film, but I can say that if we continue on our present trends, on our present course, it's very likely that in many parts of the world this will be the case. In fact, we have begun to see it in many areas. Now, licenses to have babies something that I got in trouble for some years ago for suggesting, even in Canada, that this might be necessary at some point, or at least some restriction on the right to have a child. I'm not proposing this. I was simply predicting this as one of the possible courses that society would have to seriously consider should we get ourselves into this kind of situation. But I think the promising thing in this is that it isn't necessary to get ourselves into this situation.
How do we avoid it?
We can avoid it, I think, first of all, by doing what we're now doing, and that is discussing it, understanding that the problem does exist, that the possibility does exist, and in the actions which I believe still are open to us if we take those actions in time. I'm persuaded that the future of man is going to be decided very much by the decisions taken in this generation. And we have to realize it took mankind something like 50 millennia to achieve its first billion of population on this earth. Now it takes us some 20 years to add a billion people. Now, this has got to be regarded as a serious problem.
Dr. Strong, there is a cynical view that any United Nations conference must be a talking shop at which a lot is said and very little is done. How do you answer that?
Well, I can only say that I understand that cynicism. It was one of the things that I had to consider when I took on this responsibility. But it is true. Rhetoric and very little follow-up. And right from the beginning, however, we have been determined, because of the fact that action in this field is absolutely indispensable to man's future, that governments at Stockholm would be given the maximum opportunity to take decisions which will lead to action. Now, equally, however, I believe that the nations of the world themselves are impressed with the evidence that we have amassed that suggests that we must adopt a much more cooperative attitude towards our dealing with this problem, that Stockholm must usher in a new era of international cooperation. And I believe that this will be the dominant motivation. I have to hope that. Governments have had a long time to prepare themselves. They've been deeply involved in the preparations. They have before them a series of concrete proposals, which they have had now in their hands for about 3 months. Certainly ample time to consider them. There is no basis for avoiding these decisions at Stockholm. And I believe that the governments will go to Stockholm with an overriding sense of the importance of achieving consensus on at least a large percentage of these proposals.
There you have that interview from Maurice Strong. So you see what he was saying there. It's all about doomsday. Projecting a doomsday, and the purpose of that was to create the catalyst for world governance. But unfortunately, his doomsday was all, it's a massive fraud on a global scale. They fudged the data, they fudged the modeling, they made it more extreme than it really is. And what this all has led to now is what's called the carbon tax. And we're going to talk about that in part 2. The idea of the carbon tax is to penalize the entire planet for its alleged carbon emissions. A misnomer, because the supposed culprit is an inert trace gas that comprises less than 1% of the air we breathe. So we're going to go into the science behind this, but we have evidence to show that Canada is not only carbon neutral, it is a completely negative carbon emissions, Canada. And this carbon tax is completely absurd and unnecessary in our country. It's just a tax grab to pay for this global governance. This is all a massive fraud as far as we're concerned. We're not denying that there's a slight heating in the country, getting warmer. We're not denying that. It's been exaggerated. And there's been a lot more severe warmer periods in the Earth's climate history. which has been fudged by my man and Maurice. But I'm going to close off tonight with a few quotes by this Maurice Strong, which pretty much sums up what's going on. He says, quote, "After all, sustainability means running the global environment, Earth Incorporated, like a corporation, with depreciation, amortization, and maintenance accounts. In other words, keeping the asset whole rather than undermining your natural capital." End quote. It's all about global governance. That's it. Second quote. "What pleases me most is that sustainable development is on almost everyone's agenda now." And the third quote, "We may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for the industrial civilization to collapse." Again, projecting doomsday. And I have to stress, it was Harper who adopted Agenda 2030. This is a fact. It doesn't matter which establishment party is in power. They're all behind this massive fraud. The current government, all levels of government, are implementing Agenda 2030, and they're pushing carbon tax on the Canadian people. We're going to deal with the carbon tax and the science behind so-called global warming, climate change in part 2. And I have to stress, National Citizens Alliance is the only party running in 2019 that will withdraw Canada from UN Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. And this we must do. This is absolute fraud, all about global governance. You can't make this up. But do your own research. By all means, look up Maurice Strong. Get your evidence. Go look up Agenda 21 PDF. Just Google that. Look up Agenda 2030 PDF. It's all there for you to see. This is a big scam, all about global governance and undermining Canadian sovereignty, undermining Canadian citizenry. Thank you very much. Please share this message.